Welcome to Unbelievable Stories. Today's story is full of shocking twists and real drama. Subscribe and like to stay updated. Let's dive in.
Captain Jonathan Ashford sat at his desk in his small study in Ridgeworth, Scotland, wrestling with a tough decision one autumn morning in 1895. He'd just learned he was being sent to North Africa. While the news didn't upset him, carrying out the orders felt complicated. The British Empire needed more soldiers to handle uprisings by the Berbers and Sudanese. For Jonathan, the assignment came with a promotion to major, a step closer to his dream of becoming a general. He was a career-driven officer who took pride in his work. This mission felt like the right move, though it brought its own challenges. His real dilemma was his 10-year-old daughter, Emma Caldwell. His wife, Victoria Hall, had passed away when Lila was just 7. For the past 6 years, Pierce had relied on relatives and friends to care for her. He visited occasionally, mostly seeking sympathy from family to ensure they continued looking after the girl. He also sent monthly financial support, not out of concern for Lila's well-being, but to make it easier to secure her guardianship. In truth, Captain Pierce felt little affection for Lila and resented his obligations toward her. He had married primarily to enhance his career prospects by presenting a stable family life to his superiors. To him, Lila was an impediment, a burden that complicated his ambitions. Then a thought struck him: he would send Lila to his sister-in-law, Charlotte Hayes, in America. She lived in a remote place called Kingston, Vermont. Today, he would send her a telegram. Lila was an intelligent youngster, always at the top of her class in school, despite moving from household to household as the hospitality of her cousins, aunts, and uncles ran its course. At each place she stayed, she was required to help with the household chores. Lila didn't mind; it made her feel like part of the family and the home wherever she stayed. She had been at her current foster home the longest, living with a cousin, Florence Harper. Beatrice was several years older than Captain Pierce and lived in a large cottage in a middle-class neighborhood. She lived alone and had enjoyed having Lila stay there. The problem that arose was that Beatrice was moving to Perth, Australia, within the next 8 months to live with her son, his wife, and their 3 children. In Brisbane, Lila, once again, would be for all intents and purposes homeless. There wasn't room for the young girl who was an orphan in everything but name. "I think I remind father too much of Mom," Lila thought. "Why else would he have me live with others instead of with him? I've lived with almost everyone father knows at one time or another, some more than once. But I guess now he will find us a place to live, and we'll be together." Lila was correct in her assumption that she reminded her father of his departed wife, but not for the reasons she thought. It was true that Lila bore an uncanny resemblance to her mother. She had the same long dark hair, the same blue eyes, and the same almost flawless porcelain-like complexion of her mother. Lila had inherited her father's height and build, as she was well-formed and tall for her age. She also had her father's calculating, almost cold mind. If a problem or crisis arose, she would solve it without emotion, at least until the situation was taken care of. 3 weeks later, Captain Pierce came to see his daughter. Lila hadn't seen her father for about 4 months, but it didn't make any difference. In the way of all children, she was overjoyed to see him. She loved him and had missed him. "Lila, I've been posted to North Africa," Brandon said by way of greeting. No hello, daughter, or love, no good to see you, not even a dutiful hug, just his announcement. "You will be going to live with your Aunt Charlotte Hayes and her family in America. Pack your things. Your ship sails from Bristol the day after tomorrow." "Can I go with you, father?" Lila asked hopefully. "How can we see each other if you're in Africa?" "No, my girl, you can't come with me. There are no accommodations for a family at the outpost. I will write to you monthly, and when I return to England, I will send for you." In fact, as a major, Pierce could have brought his family. He had been assigned an apartment that would allow him to accommodate his loved ones. The army knew that to keep the officers happy and morale high, they needed their families with them if possible for the months of hard duty. In fact, Pierce simply did not want to be bothered with his daughter. He quickly got Lila packed with most of her worldly possessions, which fit into 2 large suitcases and a small overnight bag. They boarded the train to Bristol early the next morning. Arriving in the port city, Captain Pierce arranged lodging for the evening. Lila didn't know it, but it would be the last night she would ever spend in England. Just after sunrise, the captain escorted Lila to a pier. The Majestic of the Seas a passenger ship was sailing for Savannah, United States on the morning tide. He gave his daughter her ticket for steerage and a large leather wallet that contained Lila's birth certificate and his sister-in-law's name and address. In the wallet, Pierce had put $70 in United States currency. He had made the money exchange at his bank before leaving for Bristol. Jonathan Ashford gave Lila a half-hearted hug, kissed her cheek, and turned her over to the care of the purser, who was in charge of getting the passengers on board the vessel. He walked away, never once turning back to see his daughter waving goodbye with tears in her eyes. The ship would carry over 600 people. There were 51 first-class berths, 120 second-class, and, on this voyage, 346 passengers in steerage. First class had private staterooms equal to any expensive hotel in England. Second class travelled in smaller but still private staterooms. The passengers travelling in steerage would share part of the cargo hold. There were no staterooms, just a great open expanse. Each family or group would stake out a section of the deck as their own. The 4 bathrooms placed in each corner of the hold would be shared by all 346 passengers without regard to sex. First class dined in a special VIP section of the main dining room, while second class used the rest of the room. A galley had been installed on the fantail for the use of the steerage passengers. They cooked their own meals using their own supplies on the fantail. They either ate on deck in good weather or down in the hold if the weather turned bad. Lila stood in line, waiting to board the ship. First-class passengers would board first, followed by second-class passengers. Neither of those groups would have to wait for the lowly steerage travelers to get out of their way. Steerage passengers would board last and be directed to the cargo hold. They would only be allowed on the fantail of the ship as it left port. There would be no standing at the rail waving goodbye to friends and family, no paper streamers thrown to celebrate the adventure, and no champagne for a toast for calm seas and a smooth voyage. Basically, it was a stay out of the way and know your place for those traveling in steerage. They were treated better than livestock, but not by much. The young girl was deep in thought as the line started to move onto the ship. Lila was sad to leave her father and her friends in England, but she was a little excited to be going to a new country. A shout broke into her thoughts and brought her back to the gangplank. A young man of about 19 was running down the gangplank, yelling and gesturing. It wasn't until he got closer that Lila understood what he was yelling. "Catch it, please. Could someone catch that blasted ticket, please?" the young man yelled as he ran back toward the pier. Lila looked up and saw a piece of paper floating on the swirling sea breeze. As it passed over her head, she reached up and snagged the object out of the air just before it could go over the side of the gangplank into the water. As the young man got closer, Lila turned to him. "Is this what you were chasing?" she asked, holding the object out to him. He smiled and took the offered paper. "Sure, and you're an angel sent to watch over this dumb farm boy." His voice had the lilt of Ireland, and his brogue was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "I'm Connor Doyle, and I thank you, young lass." He bowed and said, "Idiot that I am, I didn't hold on to my ticket when the wind came up. Without it, I would have been standing on the dock watching as you sailed away." Lila couldn't help but smile at Finnegan's accent and his expression of gratitude. "You're welcome. I'm glad I was able to catch the wayward thing. And what is your name?" "I should know the name of my savior." Looking around, Finnegan asked, "Where's your family?" "I would like to thank them also for raising such a fine soul." "I'm traveling alone to meet my aunt in America," Lila replied. "My father is an army officer and has been posted to North Africa, so it's off to America for me." Finnegan hid his surprise at her statement. What kind of man would send his young daughter halfway around the world alone, he asked silently, sending her to a strange new country with no one to protect or take care of her? To his way of thinking, her father needed a lesson in being a father. Looking at Lila, he had to admire her poise. "She's not afraid and seemed sure of herself," Finnegan continued his thought. "You still haven't told me your name, lassie." "I'm Emma Caldwell Pierce," was the answer. "Well, you'll not be alone on this sailing. Me and my friend there will be your protectors, guides, and at your beck and call," Finnegan said with another bow. "But Lila is too old and too big of a name for a wisp of a girl like yourself. I think I'll call you Rosie." "Rosie, it's a fine name and fits you well. It seems to me that you're facing your adventure with a rosy outlook." Finnegan paused and asked, "Are you sure it isn't a little of the Irish in you, Rosie?" Lila, now Rosie, had learned to gauge and judge people very well. It was a talent that came in handy, moving from household to household the way she'd been doing. She laughed at the young Irishman and judged him to be trustworthy. As they were talking, the line continued to move. The purser and his assistants directed the steerage passengers to the fantail. People bunched up on the side of the aft deck closest to the dock, trying to spot friends and family that had come down to see them off. "Do you have anyone to wave goodbye to?" Finnegan asked. Rosie shook her head. "Follow me, my lass. We'll have the pick of the best spots in our cavern. Let the others wave at the dock, it won't matter because the ship is still leaving." "We'll set ourselves up as lords and ladies, we will," Finnegan said with a grin. He grabbed one of Rose's suitcases, handed the other to his friend Liam, and led her to the hatch closest to the fantail. There was a passageway leading below decks. They continued to make their way down until they reached the berthing section of the cargo hold. Looking around, Finnegan quickly picked out a spot and placed Rose's bags at two corners of a square and his and Liam's rucksacks on the other corners. Their claim was about 12 feet on each side. "That should be enough room for a lady like yourself," Finnegan said to Rosie. "The facilities are right over there and the up passageway is just beyond. It's like having the finest stateroom on the ship, don't you think?" Rosie smiled at his humor. As Finnegan looked over Rose's shoulder for a few seconds, he suddenly said, "Be right back, lady," and hurried over to the down passageway. Rosie watched as he approached an elderly woman who was looking around in a confused manner. Finnegan bowed and said a few words to the woman, who smiled at the young Irishman. He picked up her bags and led her back to the staked-out portion of the room. "This is Mrs. Jennings," he said to Rosie and Liam. "She's traveling to meet her daughter in America. It's her first trip on the ocean, and I thought she would make a good addition to our merry band." Finnegan turned to Mrs. Jennings and completed the introductions. "This is Emma Caldwell Pierce, better known as Rosie, and this is my friend and comrade, Aidan Murphy." The newly formed family began to sort out their belongings and pick spots to sleep. Finnegan and Liam left but returned about an hour later, carrying several life jackets, 2 cots, and 6 blankets with them. Rosie quickly ran to help them. Setting the load down, Finnegan and Liam soon had the cots assembled. They also laid the life jackets down in 2 rows of 4 each and covered them with blankets. "Ladies, I give you your beds," Finnegan told them with a bow. "Not as fancy as a first-class stateroom, but it beats sleeping on the deck." "We even got pallets for Finnegan and me to sleep on," Liam said, speaking for the first time. Sometime during the afternoon, Mrs. Jennings became a mum to Finnegan, Liam, and Rosie. She had been fussing over the young people most of the morning, and the name change just seemed to fit. Mum was the one who cooked the midday meal and directed the others on how to clean up. She was also the one who secured 2 more life jackets to use as pillows. That evening, Mum insisted that the young people take a bath as well as they could, just before lights out. Mum patted Finnegan on the shoulder. "You picked a good spot, Finnegan. We are close to the up passage to the deck, so we get fresh air as long as the hatch is open. You've got us close to the bathrooms and we don't have far to go or have to wait in line very much." Mum smiled and ruffled Finnegan's and then Liam's hair. "I won't mention how you found beds for us, you Irish rascal." "No, Mum, I think the less said about the sleeping equipment, the better," Finnegan replied with a big grin. "But if you see a red-headed purser's assistant looking for someone, give me a warning, will you?" The Majestic of the Seas made good time through calm seas. She had 3 masts that held large sails, which drove her through the waves at a good clip. The ship also had 2 engines, which turned 2 large propellers. With both means of propulsion working together, the Majestic would make port in Boston in 9 to 14 days, a fast time for a ship of her size. On the second night at sea, Finnegan was awakened by the sounds of a scuffle and a muted shout. He sat up and saw a man struggling with Rosie. It was obviously a thief, as he held one of the girl's suitcases in one hand and was standing behind Rosie with his arm around her and his other hand over her mouth. As Finnegan jumped up, yelling, the man screamed and pulled his hand to his chest. Rosie had bitten him. He dropped the case and turned to run, but Finnegan caught him and began to beat on the thief. The cursing of the thief and the yelling as Liam joined the fight woke some of the neighbors, who added their voices to the din. the young man soon had the ruffian on his stomach. Liam had to stop Mum from administering more punishment as the man lay on the deck. Hearing the noise, the night watch ran into the hold and quickly took the thief into custody. Mum dealt with the sailor and explained the situation. "You'll spend the rest of the trip in the brig," the sailor said as he hustled the man out of the hold. "You'd best not be letting him out, either," Finnegan yelled at the retreating man. "If I see you again, boyo, I'll likely throw you to the fishes." The rest of the voyage was routine, except for a 24-hour period when the Majestic fought her way through a small storm. It wasn't a severe storm, but the rolling of the ship caused seasickness and many of the passengers huddled in the hold. Several of them emptied their stomachs, which led to others doing the same, creating a chain reaction. The noise made by the sick ones and the odor in the hold was intense. Mum had been on the fantail as the storm approached from several miles away. She swiftly brewed a concoction and took it below to her adopted family. "Drink this," she ordered, handing her charges cups of liquid. "It will keep you from becoming seasick." "What's in it?" Finnegan asked as he cautiously smelled the contents of his cup. "Never you mind what's in it, Finnegan," Mum replied. "But all of you drink it down. I don't want you to suffer the way some of these people are," she said, pointing to the others in the hold. Whatever was in the concoction, it worked. Neither Rosie, Finnegan, Liam, nor Mum became seasick. They were able to help some of the more unfortunate passengers. After the storm had passed, Rosie asked Mum, "Where did you learn to make that let's call it a tea? You said you'd never sailed before." "My daughter Clara wrote me about her boat trip. A lady in the cabin next to her's made the brew for her and her children, so Clara sent me the recipe when we knew I was going to join her," Mum explained. "Well, thank your darling Clara for us when you see her, please," Finnegan said. "Without her tea, we would have been in a bad way." It was the morning of the 10th day when the Majestic of the Seas sailed into Boston Harbor. The newly formed family had no more problems during the voyage. Now, they stood on the aft deck, watching the shores of America come into view. "There is the finest lady in the land," Finnegan said, staring at the American coastline. He had tears in his eyes as the ship docked. As they prepared to disembark, he asked, "Where's your Clara live, Mum?" "Clara lives right here in Boston," Mum answered. "She and her husband will be on the pier to meet me and help me through the business of entering this wonderful new country." "How about you and Liam? Where are you headed?" Rosie asked. "I have a friend in Durham, North Carolina, that is sponsoring Liam and me. He's arranged work for us with a stockyard there. Kentucky is where the horsemen come from, you know," Finnegan laughed. "Maybe we'll become horse trainers or even farm owners." Finnegan turned to Rosie and said, "And where are you headed, my fine lass?" "My aunt lives in a city called Waverly," Rosie answered. "Once I get through the lines here, I'll have to take a train to New York City and another from there to Waverly." Finnegan took Rosie's hand and kissed it like a gentleman would. "Rosie, my darling, it's been a pleasure knowing you. May St. Patrick guard you wherever you go and guide you in whatever you do, and may his loving protection be a blessing to you always." As they were letting steerage passengers disembark, the area around the gangplank was separated from the rest of the dock by a sturdy fence. A man stood on the pier, directing the steerage passengers to their points of entry. Those with family members waiting for them or sponsors were directed to one end of the docking area, while the rest of the passengers were guided to the opposite end and through a large gate in the fence. Their ferries waited to take them to the processing center on Freedom Island. Rosie and her new friends soon had to part ways as they each faced their next steps in America. At Freedom Island, the group of over 300 steerage passengers was ushered into a large warehouse-like building to begin the process of entering the United States. They were directed to areas marked with large letters hanging from the ceiling, indicating the first letter of their last name. Following instructions given by uniformed officers, the immigrants lined up accordingly. "Name?" the officious-looking man behind the counter asked in a bored voice. "Emma Caldwell Pierce," she said, but then quickly corrected herself, Rosie Pierce. She had become accustomed to the name Finnegan had given her and had to remind herself to switch back to thinking of herself as Lila. It had taken her almost 5 hours to get to this point in the process. She had undergone a physical examination, a mental state evaluation, and questioning about her destination within the United States. Letters from her aunt, her father, and a family friend vouched that Rosie would have a home to go to. The immigration officer looked up when he heard the young girl's voice. His stern expression softened. My own daughter is about the same age as this one, he thought. Where is the rest of your family, Miss Pierce? He asked. I'm traveling alone, sir, Rosie answered. My father is in the army and was posted to North Africa, so I came to America to live with my aunt. What is your aunt's name? Is she here to meet you? The officer's thoughts echoed those of Finnegan O'Leary. What kind of father would send his daughter on such a long voyage by herself? Charlotte Hayes Lockwood is my aunt. She lives in Kingston, Vermont, Rosie replied to the question. My father told me to take a train to New York City and then another to Waverly. She will meet me at the train station. The officer smiled and said, That's in Missouri, we call them states over here. After checking her birth certificate and the letters she carried, he spent several minutes writing on a form. When he finished, he handed Rosie some official-looking papers with a government seal stamped on them and several signatures. These are your entry approval papers, Miss Pierce, he said. Keep them safe and don't lose them. He turned and called to another officer, Jim, cover for me, will you? I'm going to take my lunch break. Sure thing, Don, the other officer responded. The man who had helped her introduced himself as Edward Turner. I have a daughter about your age, he said as he came around the counter. Why don't you come with me, and I'll show you which ferry to take back to the city. Outside, Donald walked Rosie to an area where ferries waited. Take one of these across the harbor. There's no charge, it will let you off at Pier 26. From there, take the Green Line trolley, he instructed, looking at her to make sure she understood. It will bring you to Central Station, and you'll need to ask a conductor how to transfer to the line that goes to the main train depot. Yes, I understand, Mr. Kelly, Rosie said gratefully. Thank you for your help. Do you have money for the trolleys and a train ticket? He asked, concerned. Yes, sir, she replied, showing him her leather wallet. My father gave me $70 in American money. Put that away, girl, Don ordered, looking around to see if anyone had noticed. He reached into his vest, pulled out a cloth bag with a drawstring, and emptied its tobacco contents onto the ground. He placed a few coins in the bag and pulled the string tight. The trolley fare will cost a nickel and another 5 cents for the transfer. I put enough in there to cover it. He handed her the bag. Keep your money on your person, where pickpockets and thieves can't get to it. Bending down to a level, he said softly, It's a brave lass you are, Rosie Pierce. Good luck to you. Then, Donald turned and headed back to the processing center. Hope she makes it okay, he thought. Rosie watched him walk away for a moment, then boarded the ferry that would take her to her new life. Arriving at the dock across the harbor, she showed her papers to a guard at the gate and entered the bustling streets of New York City. There were several food carts along the walkway selling various snacks. She stopped at one and paid a dime for 2 meat-filled pastries called knishes. Rosie ate them as she walked, thinking to herself, those are very good. Of course, she realized she was so hungry that almost anything would have tasted good. She saw a sign that read Green Line Trolley and stood beneath it to wait. Shortly, a trolley pulled up and she climbed aboard, paying the fare and asking for a transfer ticket as Mr. Kelly had suggested. Going on a train trip, are you? The conductor asked, noticing her British accent. Yes, sir. I have to go to Missouri to live with my aunt, Rosie answered. It's young you are for taking such a long trip on your own, the conductor remarked. Yes, sir, but I have to do it, Rosie replied with a determined look. The conductor motioned to her about 15 minutes later. This is your stop, lass. Right over there is where you catch the transfer to Central Station, he said, pointing to a sign across the street. Rosie followed his instructions and soon boarded another trolley heading to Central Station. The city continued to amaze her with its towering buildings and crowded streets. Compared to Bristol, New York City was an entirely different world. She passed a huge building with a Metropolitan Museum of Art carved into the stone over the door. That's the biggest building I've ever seen, she murmured to herself. At Central Station, she stepped off the trolley and found herself in a vast, bustling train terminal. The open space seemed almost as large as the processing center on Freedom Island. She spotted the sign for ticket sales and made her way over, asking for the cost of a ticket to Waverly. The next train to Atlanta leaves in 2 hours, with a transfer from there to Waverly, the clerk said. That'll be $15. Rosie nodded and left the window. She went to the restroom, where she retrieved the money from her hidden wallet, tucked inside the waistband of her petticoat. After purchasing the ticket, she had just enough left for a small meal and any unexpected expenses. Returning to the waiting area, she found a nearby food cart selling sandwiches and bought one for 80 cents. It was enormous, a whole loaf filled with meat, cheese, and pickles. Rosie ate half and wrapped the rest in the paper it came in, saving it for the long train ride. When it was time to board the train, Rosie chose a seat near the back of the car, next to a window. She placed her suitcases on the seat beside her and settled in. The conductor began moving through the car, collecting tickets. "How far is it to Waverley, sir?" Rosie asked when he reached her. "It's about 1,300 miles, he replied, taking note of her English accent. "We'll reach Atlanta in 30 hours, then it's another half day to Waverley." Rosie calculated in her head. "That's more than 1,600 kilometers, she said quietly, looking out the window. It was hard for her to fathom traveling such a distance in one trip. Back home, the whole of England wasn't even that far from end to end. The train lurched forward, and Rosie felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She was leaving the familiar behind and heading into the unknown, but for the first time in her journey, she felt a sense of accomplishment. She had navigated her way from England across the Atlantic, through New York City, and was now making her way deeper into America. As the train rolled westward, leaving the city behind, the landscape gradually changed from urban sprawl to open countryside. Rosie saw farmland stretching as far as the eye could see, interspersed with small villages and clusters of trees. The fields seemed endless, far larger than the farms she was used to seeing in England. Rose's journey to Waverley had only just begun, and the road ahead was still long, but she felt a renewed sense of determination. She looked forward to finally meeting her Aunt Charlotte Hayes and beginning a new life in America, a place that already seemed as vast and full of possibility as she had imagined. The train chugged steadily onward through the American countryside, and Rosie found herself staring out the window at the vast landscape. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the fields, the train slowed down for a brief stop at a small station. Passengers stretched their legs, and Rosie took the opportunity to get some fresh air. The station was nothing more than a wooden platform with a single attendant, who helped load a few crates of produce and mail onto the train. After a few minutes, the whistle blew, and the train began to move again. Rosie returned to her seat, feeling a little tired but also curious about the towns and cities they would pass through on the way to Atlanta. She ate the remaining half of her sandwich and settled in for the night. It wasn't long before her eyelids grew heavy and she drifted off to sleep, the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels lulling her into a deep slumber. Rosie awoke at dawn to the sight of a sprawling river out the window, its waters reflecting the pale light of the morning sky. That must be the Mississippi, she thought, recalling her geography lessons. The conductor confirmed her suspicion a little later as they approached the city of Atlanta. "Next stop, Atlanta," he called out, walking down the aisle. "We'll be here for an hour, folks. Time to stretch your legs and get a bite to eat." Rosie gathered her belongings and disembarked with the other passengers. Atlanta was a bustling city, much larger than she had anticipated, with steamboats lining the banks of the river and horse-drawn carriages rattling along the cobblestone streets. The station itself was a hive of activity, with porters, vendors, and travelers going about their business. As she walked along the platform, Rosie felt a little overwhelmed by the crowds and noise. She found a quieter spot near the edge of the platform and took a seat on a bench. While she waited for the next train to Waverley, she took out the official papers she had been given at Freedom Island and reviewed them to ensure everything was in order. Her entry approval, letters from her aunt, and the train tickets were still safely tucked inside her travel bag. About 40 minutes later, the announcement came for the passengers headed to Waverley to board the train. Rosie made her way to the designated platform and climbed aboard. She found a seat next to a window again, eager to see the changing scenery as the train left Atlanta behind. The journey continued for several more hours, with the train moving deeper into the countryside. The fields of wheat and corn seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and Rosie marveled at the size of the farms and the open spaces. It was so different from the neatly sectioned plots of land she had known in England. As the train rolled through the gently undulating landscape, she could see clusters of farmhouses and barns in the distance, some with children waving at the passing train. By late afternoon, Rosie was getting anxious, constantly checking the time and peering out the window for any sign of the town. She had never felt this far from home, yet something about the quiet countryside made her feel a little more at ease. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the conductor walked down the aisle, calling out, "Kingston, Vermont, coming up next. We'll be arriving in about 10 minutes." Rosie gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark, her heart beating a little faster in anticipation. She was finally about to meet her Aunt Charlotte Hayes after so many weeks of travel. When the train slowed to a halt at the small station, she stepped onto the platform and took a deep breath of the fresh country air. The station was quiet, with only a few other passengers disembarking. Rosie looked around for any sign of her aunt, but no one seemed to be waiting for her. She walked over to a man standing near the platform. He appeared to be the station master, wearing a cap and vest. "Excuse me, sir," Rosie began. "I'm looking for Mrs. Charlotte Hayes Lockwood. She's my aunt, and she was supposed to meet me here." The station master scratched his chin. "Don't recall anyone by that name here today, miss, but if she's expecting you, she might be running a little late. Happens sometimes, especially out here in the country. You're welcome to wait inside the station, where it's warmer." Rosie nodded, trying not to feel discouraged. She took a seat on one of the wooden benches inside the small station building and watched the clock tick away. The minutes turned into an hour and then two, as the light outside began to fade. There was still no sign of Aunt Charlotte Hayes. Finally, the station master came over and sat down next to her. "Miss, it's getting late. If you know where your aunt lives, I can give you directions. It's not a big town, but it's a fair walk from here." Rosie pulled out the piece of paper with her aunt's address on it and handed it to him. "Here's the address," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He studied the note for a moment and then nodded. "That's about 1.5 miles outside town. You could hire a carriage, but if you're up for it, it's not too far to walk." Rosie hesitated. She was tired from the journey and carrying her suitcases, but she didn't want to spend what little money she had left on a carriage ride. "I'll walk," she decided. "I can manage." The station master showed her the direction to take, and Rosie set off, her heart pounding with each step as she made her way along the quiet road. The landscape grew darker as dusk fell, and the houses became more spaced out. After walking for about 20 minutes, she saw a small farmhouse up ahead, with light streaming from the windows. It was the only house she had seen in a while, and she hoped it might be the right one. As she approached, an elderly man who had been sitting on the porch called out to her. "You lost, young lady?" he asked in a kind voice. "I don't see many folks out walking this time of night." Rosie stepped closer. "I'm looking for Mrs. Charlotte Hayes Lockwood," she explained. "She's my aunt, and I've just arrived from England." The old man's eyes brightened. "You must be Emma Caldwell, or Rosie, as I heard you like to be called. Charlotte Hayes has been talking about nothing else for weeks. You're nearly there, lass. Her place is just a bit farther up the road." Relief washed over Rosie. "Thank you, sir," she said. "I wasn't sure I was on the right path." "You're almost home," the man reassured her. "Give my regards to your aunt, and tell her old George Thompson says hello." Rosie hurried down the road, and soon she saw a large white farmhouse surrounded by fields, with smoke curling from the chimney and lights glowing in the windows. She walked up the pathway to the front porch, where she set down her suitcases and knocked on the door. A moment later, the door opened, and a woman with graying hair and a kind face peered out. "Yes?" she asked, her eyes scanning Rosie from head to toe. "Aunt Charlotte Hayes, it's me, Emma Caldwell, Rosie said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've come all the way from England." Charlotte Hayes's face broke into a wide smile, and she threw open the door. "My dear girl, you're here at last. Come in," she exclaimed, pulling Rosie into a warm embrace. "We've been waiting for you. I'm so sorry I wasn't there to meet your train. I got the days mixed up and thought you were arriving tomorrow." Rosie felt the weight of her journey lift as she hugged her aunt back. "It's all right," she said softly. "I'm just glad to finally be here. You must be exhausted, my dear. Let's get you settled in," Charlotte Hayes said, leading Rosie inside. "Welcome to your new home." For the first time since leaving England, Rosie felt a sense of belonging and relief. She had made it, overcoming every obstacle along the way, and now a new chapter of her life was about to begin in Waverley. Rosie followed her aunt into the cozy farmhouse, the warmth of the kitchen enveloping her as the delicious scent of stew drifted through the air. She was grateful for the embrace of the homely atmosphere after such a long journey. Aunt Charlotte Hayes led her to a small bedroom at the back of the house, where a quilt-covered bed awaited her. "This will be your room, dear," Charlotte Hayes said. "I've made it as comfortable as I could, but if there's anything you need, just let me know. You must be tired from all the traveling. Why don't you freshen up a bit, and then we'll have some supper? I'm sure you're hungry." Rosie set down her bags and looked around the little room. It wasn't grand, but it was welcoming, with lace curtains on the window and a small wooden dresser by the bed. She felt a sense of calm wash over her as she finally allowed herself to relax. After splashing some cool water on her face from the wash basin and changing into fresh clothes, she made her way back to the kitchen. Charlotte Hayes was ladling stew into bowls at the kitchen table, where a loaf of freshly baked bread sat. "Come, sit, Rosie," she said. "I want to hear all about your journey. I can hardly believe you made it all the way from England on your own." As they ate, Rosie recounted her experiences from the voyage across the Atlantic to navigating Freedom Island, then the long train rides. She spoke of the people who had helped her along the way: Finnegan, Liam, Mum, Mr. Kelly, the conductors, and the kind station master in Waverley. Aunt Charlotte Hayes listened with rapt attention, shaking her head in amazement. "My goodness, what an adventure you've had," Charlotte Hayes said. "You're a brave young lady, Rosie. I don't know many grown men who would have handled that journey as well as you did." Rosie blushed slightly at the praise. "I just did what I had to do," she said. "There were times when I wasn't sure I'd make it, but somehow I always found someone to lend a helping hand." "Well, you're here now, and that's what matters," Charlotte Hayes said with a reassuring smile. "This is your home, and you'll never have to worry about being passed around from place to place again. I've arranged for you to start school here next week. It's a bit different from what you're used to, but I'm sure you'll do just fine." Rosie felt a lump rise in her throat. It had been years since she'd felt truly wanted. "Thank you, Aunt Charlotte Hayes," she said quietly. "It means so much to finally have a place where I belong." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustment. Rosie quickly settled into life in Waverley, helping Charlotte Hayes with the household chores, tending to the chickens, and working in the vegetable garden. She found the rhythm of farm life soothing, and as autumn deepened, she grew to love the peacefulness of the countryside. At school, she was welcomed by her classmates, though she occasionally struggled with the American way of doing things. She was particularly amused by how different American history was taught compared to what she had learned in England. One Saturday, Charlotte Hayes took Rosie to visit their neighbor, Grandpa George Thompson, the elderly man who had helped her find her way when she arrived. He welcomed her with open arms, telling her stories of his own travels and adventures. He had once visited England as a young man, and he and Rosie enjoyed talking about places they both knew, albeit from different times and perspectives. Grandpa Ben quickly became a beloved figure in her life, like a grandfather she had never had. As the months passed, Rosie grew more confident and happy. She worked hard at school and became an active part of the community, joining in on local gatherings and even learning to ride a horse. Her American classmates were fascinated by her British accent and tales of life back in England, and she found herself fitting in more easily than she had expected. The years went by quickly, and Rosie thrived in Waverley. She graduated from high school at the age of 19 and was among the top students in her class. Charlotte Hayes couldn't have been prouder. Rosie found a job as a clerk at the local general store, where she enjoyed meeting people from all over the region. Life was stable and good. When she turned 18, Aunt Charlotte Hayes introduced her to a young man named Henry Weston, a hard-working and kind-hearted farmhand who lived nearby. He had often seen Rosie at the store and around town and had taken quite a liking to her. The two quickly became friends, and their relationship blossomed into a romance. They shared a love of the outdoors, fishing at the nearby river, and riding horses together through the fields. After 2 years of courtship, Oliver proposed to Rosie, and they were married in a simple ceremony at the church in Waverley, with Charlotte Hayes beaming by her side. They moved into a small farmhouse on the edge of town, where they began their life together. Before long, they were blessed with children of their own. Rosie often thought about her journey to America and how far she had come since that first day in Boston Harbor. She and Oliver raised their children with love and a sense of adventure, instilling in them the courage to face challenges head-on. Rosie never forgot the people who had helped her along the way. She kept in touch with Aunt Millie and Uncle Ted in England through letters, and they remained a source of support and connection to her past. She would often recount stories of her journey across the ocean to her own children, telling them of Finnegan and Liam, Mr. Kelly, and the others who had made her journey less lonely and frightening. It was a legacy of kindness that she passed on, encouraging her children to be generous and helpful to others. The years continued to roll by, and Rosie lived a full and happy life. She became a grandmother herself, welcoming grandchildren into the farmhouse she and Oliver had made their home. She often hosted big family gatherings where the children and grandchildren would run and play in the fields, just as she had once imagined when she first arrived in America. One day, on her 50th birthday, there was a knock at the door. Rosie answered it to find an elderly man with a cane standing on the porch. His face was lined and his hair had turned white, but his eyes held a familiar glint. "Hello, Rosie," the man said, his voice weak but unmistakably familiar. "Don't you know me, girl? It's your father, Jonathan Ashford." Rosie froze for a moment. The last memory she had of her father was watching him walk away from her at the pier in Bristol, leaving her to sail to America alone. She had not heard from him in over 40 years. Now, here he stood, frail and old, asking for her help. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold and distant. "I'm sick, and I have no one else to turn to," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I've come to seek help from my daughter." Rosie stared at him, the emotions of that long-ago abandonment stirring within her. "You left me alone on that dock all those years ago," she said. "You didn't want me then, and now, after all this time, you expect me to take care of you." She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Oliver standing beside her. He had heard the conversation and understood her pain. He gave her a gentle nod, silently supporting whatever choice she would make. Rosie reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope with some money inside. "Here's $70, the same amount you gave me when you put me on that ship," she said, handing it to her father. "Now we're even. I suggest you find your way elsewhere." Brandon looked at her with a mixture of sadness and regret. Without another word, he turned and walked away, the cane tapping on the ground as he moved slowly down the porch steps. Rosie closed the door, feeling a sense of finality. She had faced her past and chosen to live her life on her own terms. Her family, Oliver, her children and grandchildren, were all that truly mattered to her now. She felt free of the burden she had carried since she was a little girl left behind in England. Rosie Pierce lived out the rest of her days in Waverley, surrounded by the love of her family. She passed away peacefully at the age of 92, leaving behind a legacy of courage, resilience, and kindness. Her children and grandchildren continued to tell her story, the tale of a brave young girl who crossed an ocean and carved out a new life for herself in a strange and wonderful land. Her story became a reminder to them all that no matter where you start, it's your heart and determination that define who you are. And so, the memory of Emma Caldwell Rosie Pierce lived on, a great lady whose journey inspired generations to come. Emma Caldwell's journey is a testament to resilience and hope, showing how courage can turn challenges into a life filled with love. What inspired you most about her story? Share in the comments and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales. See you next time.